Look, I don't know as much as you might think. I'm a chemist. I don't run any of the operations. Or didn't, rather.
How did you end up working for these guys anyway? Vincent said as he nudged the dead Rovik he was sitting on.
You're not familiar with my species?
Vincent shook his head.
We're exceptionally prone to motivations of self-preservation. We have almost no sense of loyalty, and the only common cases of sacrifice involve mothers and young. I'm male, so that's not a driving factor for me.
Vincent snorted at the explanation. The Xeno didn't seem to mind being honest about his species, it seemed. Well, that means they can threaten you. Still doesn't fully explain it.
No! I was kidnapped a little over a year ago. I had no chance of escaping, and they told me some very painful things they'd do if I resisted or the like. So I just got to work.
Vincent frowned. Black blood has been manufactured for more than a year? The scientist shook his head.
No, I was brought in to start setting up labs like this one. Then there was something wrong with the first batch of husks, I guess. Or it was lost or something. And then they sent me some new bodies. The first few husks were female, but the product wasn't what our benefactors desired.
Who were your benefactors? The rodent shrugged and pointed at the dead Rovik Vincent was using as a chair.
He was my main contact with the outside world through my captivity. They captured other chemists, brought us in for the early testing phases, until they had something they wanted us to focus on. Once we started mass production of the drugs similar to the current form, they split us up to run different labs.
Vincent nodded. This was clearly a very well set up operation, but as he'd noticed, the felons themselves weren't well trained. Whoever the mysterious benefactors were, they'd pick some big boss to run the street-side operation. But clearly someone had plans. He couldn't help but wonder who the hell was going through all this trouble, and why. There had never been any hint of organized crime during his patrols, and suddenly he'd stumbled on evidence that not only was there some sort of organization, but that they'd been working quietly for quite some time. I've seen small labs, just collections of beakers and tubes and stuff in apartments. What were those if you're making the stuff here?
That's likely the final step you're seeing. What I do here is bring the product to a stable form that can be distributed to smaller, much simpler operations, where you follow what amounts to a cooking recipe to finish the drug.
So what was wrong with the female husk? The rodent shrugged.
Nothing as far as I know. I'd never seen your species until then, so it's not like I know what to look for in any physical abnormalities. Yet they didn't like the product her body produced. It made people rather happy and energetic.
Vincent arched his brow at that. That sounds like a much better drug.
I'd concur, but apparently that was not the desired effect. The new husks...
He motioned to the fridge with the hand that wasn't cuffed to the lab equipment.
Produce a drug that's more addictive, fills the user with various emotions, and is quite powerful stuff. The other one was rather light, and it made people feel good, but didn't quite draw them back in, apparently. If the reports were to be understood, those users all cleaned up after just one use.
That doesn't make sense. None of this does. He hadn't been paying attention. He'd tried to say it. So he gasped and dropped forward onto his hands and knees as he puked, feeling the intense pain in his skull as he began to cry tears of blood, and more dripped from his ears. The rodent leaned back against the machinery and tried to pull away as much as the cuff would let him.
Are you horrifically ill?
Vincent shook his head and held up a finger for a moment. Then he had to spit a few times, trying to get the trail of spit to stop stretching from his lips, before he sat back up on top of the Rovik. I was experimented on. Whenever I try to name my species, or try and describe certain aspects of my home, I get violently ill. He pulled open the small medkit that was attached to all combat harnesses, and began to wipe the blood off his face from his ears with some gauze. The rodent was still clearly cautious, but slowly relaxed. As I was saying, Vincent continued once he was confident he'd gotten most of the blood off. My species doesn't have anything in our blood that I can think of that would produce any of the effects you're talking about.
The chemical composition of your blood would not suggest this, but I've seen it work. It seems to vary depending on the husk. Your blood, for example, has a very intense effect.
Mine? You had one of my husks?
No, but some of your blood has been collected from your various bodies after death, but before patrols have collected it. We just ran through experiments to make sure what we were seeing wasn't a fluke, and then never did it again.
Why? What happened?
The user would immediately launch into a suicidal rampage of hate and anger. It also seemed to boost combat effectiveness greatly. They gave it to one of my species, who I'm sure you'll agree are not impressive physically. He killed 3 Vernek and grievously injured a Servian slasher. What I found most interesting was actually how inventive he was with sudden and impromptu weapons. I don't think he'd ever engaged in hand-to-hand combat before, and he had no trouble using whatever he could get to great effect.
So I make people go berserk?
Yes, but not to others of the same species.
What?
If it was given to a Rovik, for example, that Rovik would not harm other Rovik.
He paused, as they heard faint echoes of weapons fire and fighting.
It would appear the commandos have arrived.
It'll take some time for them to get up here, and then more to get through the foam. Vincent nodded at the doors he'd blocked off. So, what's the point of all this? To make credits?
I doubt it. From what I understood, demand far exceeds supply, but they won't even charge enough to let me get better equipment. I understand the street dealers make a great deal of profit.
Why do they even like it so much? I see them at times, dripping that black shit from their mouths. The rodent shrugged.
I am not a junkie. Drugs of this nature hold no appeal to me in theory, but I've seen those who do not exhibit the normal tendencies or personalities of junkies, who are forced to take the substance to grow addicted to it. From what I understand, it gives them visions, feelings, emotions, a whole host of sensations that they begin to crave. As mentioned, I can't find the chemical composition that is responsible for this, but I'm not a biologist either. It is, however, the only drug I've ever heard of that seems to work across all species. Normally things like synth, for example, only affect certain species, which makes it hard to develop something all users can take.
I use synth myself.
Now, synth makes more sense to me. It's simply a synthetic version of various chemicals found naturally in some species. It mimics these and opens up various nerves that I'd expect to see positive reactions to.
So, some blood of my species creates a wide and varied drug that works on everyone who lives in the city?
Yes. Well, I mean, with treatment and other additives. Are you a chemist?
No. Vincent lightly chuckled at the very idea.
Then that's the best I can explain it.
Vincent leaned back and rubbed his chin. This explained things, and yet only seemed to give him more questions than answers. The husk, you mentioned. They lost the live version?
Yes. It's my understanding he escaped with the female. As I mentioned, they got something. I don't know what it was from the live body that better tempered the product. Without it, the reports I get are worrisome. I assume your husks begin to deform without some sort of chemical they receive from the prime?
What? Vincent asked, confused.
Isn't that how you keep coming back? You have a prime that creates smaller, less capable workers that share thoughts, like some insect colonies.
No, nothing like that. I have a black box in my skull that records memories, and my next clone gets them synced. The rodent frowned at that, and it was his turn to be confused.
What? How is that possible to have clones? I've never heard of memories being successfully swapped between bodies. Every experiment ever done regarding cloning has been a failure. The tissue and muscles and all that can be recreated, but it's never a whole body. It always comes out deformed and horribly flawed. Plus, you can't copy thoughts.
Vincent shrugged. I guess my species is special. I just don't understand how. All this stuff with the blood doesn't make sense. I used to think the name Black Blood was just a nickname. I didn't realize it was actually blood.
We never tell people it was. It just happened the nickname is accurate.
But how is it that the blood from the 3 different... He had to catch himself. From the husks and my own blood. How can they all give different results? It shouldn't work like that. From everything I've ever heard, none of that can be transferred through blood. The rodent shrugged.
How do you find a soul? How do you measure one? Either there is a valid scientific reason for this that we simply haven't been able to determine.
He paused for a moment before continuing.
Or there isn't.
Vincent slowly shook his head as he tried to process what he'd learned, while talking to the scientist. Is it that simple?
It is a simplified set of options, but I think more or less those are the two possible outcomes.
For the first time in months, Vincent wished he had a cigarette. There was alcohol, sure, but something about just having something to smoke while he tried to sort everything out would be nice. He looked back at the rodent. The benefactors. No clue who they are? The rodent shook his head. Then they both looked up as there was some sort of explosion in the building. The commandos are getting closer. Vincent had no idea what would happen to the rodent after this. Would he get to talk to him again? He'd better assume this was the only time he'd ever see him and ask everything he wanted to. Or at least, as much as he could before the commandos broke through the foam. What about the worms? They were the ones who experimented on me. The rodent nodded slowly.
They're masters of both genetic and biological sciences. Maybe they found a breakthrough Union scientists haven't seen, or were unwilling to explore for ethical reasons. However, I don't know how or why they'd set up this operation. They hate the Union for reasons I don't understand. I've never heard of them working with anyone outside of their own species. What's their motivation for all this?
Vincent shrugged. He hated how many questions there still were. Fuck, he hated how many new questions there were now. He knew enough to see how much he was missing, instead of finding what he wanted to answer anything. Of course, that was the point of these sorts of organizations, wasn't it? No one who would be willing to talk would know enough, and anyone who knew enough was willing to die.
I do know they want to cause trouble.
Vincent looked up as the rodent volunteered that. Why? Or why now? Patrol didn't even know this whole organization existed until basically today.
I don't know the details, but they want to start tying down as many patrols as possible around the city. It is common knowledge that there aren't enough Yervesh to stop all crime. They just keep it in check. Perhaps they want to worsen the situation until they aren't even able to keep it in check?
Vincent slowly shook his head. Then it isn't a criminal organization. They'd sell this shit at top dollar and do everything possible in their power to keep the authorities in the dark about their existence as long as possible. They wouldn't give them an excuse to increase patrol presence and funding. The rodent shrugged.
Then they aren't criminals. What does that leave?
Terrorists, or agents of a hostile nation, which I suppose is the same thing but for different purposes. Vincent did not like that idea one bit. It's just the Union, right?
The Union is the only organized multi-species nation. The worms fight the Union, but don't have planets. Their fleet keeps moving. I know little about them, but I think little in general is known. There are species that aren't technologically advanced. Once the Union finds them, they're uplifted and join the Union. No one resists except the worms.
Vincent needed to talk to the dragon again. Maybe someone in power could help shine a light on all this. Then again, he might be as lost as Vincent. This was clearly not a setup that the mysterious benefactors had intended. For him to stumble across their existence was obviously a fluke, and yet, simply knowing they existed only hinted at a greater danger that he had no evidence to support to his superiors. Would the Yervesh trust the ranting and raving of the insane Creature 88? He looked to the rodent. Is there anything else you've got that might shed light on any of this? The rodent shrugged.
Whoever is behind this is clearly motivated. The equipment they need to store the husks, or create more of your kind, don't do that like I had imagined. Then they must be exceptionally well funded. Where can they hide all that gear? Not in places like this.
He waved his hand around the lab.
The very few times I saw any of the guards that were with the flight craft bringing in supplies, they weren't a species I recognized.
Could you describe them?
They looked like satyrs.
Vincent leaned back at the name. What? Like mythical goat men? He asked, rather suspicious that the mouse Zeno would have the same myth. Was this the translator stuff messing about in his head again?
Oh, you have heard of them. Yes.
I saw a dragon who had a species like that in his employ.
Then ask him what they are. They aren't familiar to me.
Vincent rubbed his chin as he had the first solid lead that actually gave him a direction instead of a question. They both turned as they could hear something hissing, and the foam in the doorway began to smoke.
It would appear that we're out of time.
Vincent nodded and stood, pulling his magnum free as the rodent looked from the weapon up at Vincent. I don't have a reason to kill you, do I? Vincent asked.
What? No! Why would you do that? I've answered all your questions.
I just want to check. You never know what can happen when someone you think you can trust betrays you. I mean, you could think that someone has been perfectly honest with you, but then it turns out they were lying the entire time, and in fact pointed you to something else they knew as a lie in order to waste time.
What?
The rodent was clearly nervous, as he stared at the magnum before looking back up at Vincent.
I swear I've been honest. I have no reason to lie. I've gained nothing but stress from this captivity. If I find any way out, or remember anything, or have information you need, I'll give it to you right away.
Vincent leaned down to look the rodent in the eyes as he pulled back, yanking against the hand cuffed to the machine. If you really do value your life, then remember that I'm always out there. I don't really die. I can't be stopped. At best, I'm slowed down, and all that does is piss me off. Do you understand?
Yes, I understand.
Vincent leaned back up. Good. He walked towards the foam, watching it shake and smoke as the commandos applied whatever the hell it was that made the stuff melt. Then it occurred to him that he didn't know how long it had been, and the commandos hadn't said anything to him on comms. He quickly backed up and tapped the comms unit. Handler, are the commandos at the lab? He looked back at the rodent, and then the jamming device. It was still off. Quickly moving back, he uncuffed the rodent. Got anywhere to hide? He quickly nodded and scurried towards the back of the fridge unit.
It won't be comfortable, but it should work.
Good. I don't need to know. Unless I say you can come out, try not to be found. I have no idea who's on the other side of that foam. He watched the open passage as the foam was pulling down away from the ceiling as it melted, or it turned to gas, or whatever the hell it was doing. Looking around, he moved to duck behind one of the heavy-looking pieces of lab equipment, praying that it wasn't in fact full of explosive material. He tapped on his comm once more, just to try. Shade to any patrol units. Respond. He was met with static. By now, the foam was half gone, but he couldn't hear anyone calling out to see if he was all right inside. Then, he finally heard a voice. Give us the rodent. Or what? You'll fucking kill me? Be reasonable, Shade. We can make your death slow. And how many of you will die trying to take that one out? The voice stayed quiet for a moment, as whoever was talking seemed to realize that Vincent wasn't impressed by threats of violence. We'll exchange him for a black box. Vincent frowned at that. I have all mine. Not yours. Vincent blinked as he processed that. Whose then? One from the female. So they were directly connected to the woman whose memories he'd found with the other human. You might as well have some happy memories, some nice emotions. Surely you're tired of anger, hate, and violence. You can't stop us anyway. Why waste the energy trying? That's what got Vincent. If someone honestly felt that, then he sure as hell had to do everything he could to stop them, even if he didn't know what it was they were trying. All right, come on in. No weapons. I'll hand the rodent over once you give me the black box. We aren't stupid, Creature 88. You send out the rodent, then we give you the black box. Not a fucking chance. He heard weapons fire in the distance. It could only be a few floors away. That had to be the commandos. You're dealing with a time limit. Why not just fuck off and forget the rodent? He's just a chemist. No point dying over him. Our lives only give service to something greater.
Surely you can appreciate that of all people, Creature 88.
They sounded like fanatics. I don't know what you've heard, but that's really not how I operate. The other doorway filled with foam hadn't shifted, which meant he had to be dealing with a small team. This was some sort of emergency response to the raid, not a full-scale assault. The foam on the door he was watching was now just a goopy puddle of something. It was entirely open, and he had no idea what would be coming through the door. There was a clang, and he braced against the lab equipment he was using for cover, when he saw a small cylinder that began to pour out smoke. You think that'll help you? I've got a state-of-the-art mask. Heat vision.
We also have heat vision. The lab is too hot and would obscure us if you tried.
Vincent quietly cursed. He tried to be as quiet as possible as he listened. Then he thought he heard something clank near the door. He waited another second and leaned out from cover, firing into the smoke screen wildly with his magnum. There were 2 screams as weapons fire began to pulse out of the smoke. He ducked back behind cover and quickly opened the cylinder to reload as whoever was trying to get in fired upon the lab. Beakers shattered, equipment caught fire, and he could hear the whine of machinery trying to operate as it was damaged, but they were all firing past him. After several very long seconds of continued fire, they finally stopped and he leaned back out, firing once more, trying to aim for the parts of the smoke he thought the fire had been coming from. He heard another scream and a thud this time, but then had to quickly duck behind the lab equipment as the fire was much more focused on his position this time.
Advance! Kill him!
He heard the voice from before bark out. 2 figures emerged from the smoke, and he immediately thought of the satyrs that had been guarding the dragon's estate. Then the rodent was telling the truth. The difference was instead of shining silver in bright, obvious colors, they were wearing matte black. He didn't have time to reload, and instead quickly pulled the queers out from the back of his jacket, extending his arms as he unloaded on the lead figure. It took the bulk of the green pulses before finally falling, which meant that their armor was more than just for show. The second figure had some sort of wicked knives in hand, and he dropped the energy repeaters as he tossed a shock beetle toward it. But the figure quickly cut the beetle in 2 in midair, ignoring the bright blue spark that erupted from the body. Vincent quickly pulled his knife out, but with his other hand he grabbed a nearby beaker, tossing it at the assailant. The satyr sliced at the beaker just like the beetle, getting splashed with some sort of bluish-red liquid that didn't seem to burn him or affect him in any way, which ruined Vincent's plan. He had to quickly parry a slash with his knife before dancing back from a jab with the other blade. When he tried to parry again, the satyr did some sort of twist with his own knife, and it wrenched Vincent's hand open, sending his knife flying off. Realizing the fight was suddenly 2 knives to none, he surprised the satyr by quickly lunging forward, grabbing the satyr's wrists before pulling his head back, and then slamming it forward into the black mask of the satyr. There was a heavy crunch, and Vincent's teeth clicked hard. The smooth mask of the satyr was now heavily cracked, and the figure was staggering, dropping the knives. It seemed like Vincent had the thicker skull, and better mask for that matter. He let go of one of the satyr's wrists and drove his fist into the satyr's stomach, only to gasp in pain as the armor proved far more painful to punch than he expected. Before the satyr could counter, however, Vincent yanked his opponent by the arm, turning and slamming him into the lab equipment that Vincent had used as cover. The satyr grunted out, and then Vincent grabbed the back of his head, slamming the already cracked mask repeatedly into the corner. He wasn't much up on martial arts, but he was more than familiar with the strategy of repeatedly hitting people until they stopped moving. He kept at it until he heard the entire mask shatter and break, and saw black shards dropping away, revealing the somewhat dog-like face beneath, instead of what one would expect from a real mythical satyr. The Xeno was bleeding heavily from cuts along his face, and looked to be out of it, so Vincent let go and watched the figure slump to the ground. He'd heard 3 screams, and he had for sure taken out 2 more. How big was the team sent after him? With a little reprieve, he pulled his magnum back out of the holster, and began to reload, his eyes on the cloud of smoke in front of the door. "You're running out of guys."
"There are always more. It would seem you've won this round, Shade. I can't effectively retrieve the rodent, and still dispose of the bodies of the dead. And I'll give you another offer. You let my guy in there walk out, and we simply leave.
Huh. Why would I do that?
And because he's got a few kilos of explosive rigged to his body.
Vincent looked down and saw the figure he figured he had knocked out at his feet, looking up and clutching a trigger of some sort in one hand. His thumb was pressing the button down already, which likely meant it was a dead man's switch. Let it go? Boom! Vincent growled at the figure, but then nodded to the door.
Get the fuck out of here.
The satyr was wounded, clearly, but shakily managed to find his feet, walking towards the smoke as he reached down with the hand not holding the trigger device, and pulling the leg of the dead satyr towards the smoke. Soon he was gone, and Vincent was crouched behind the machine watching. As the smoke finally began to clear after a very tense minute, he saw nothing. There weren't any bodies. He didn't see bloodstains. Fuck, even the canister the smoke had come from was gone. Who the fuck were these guys? The only clue he had was that they'd rather keep all proof of their existence than get their hands on the rodent. That, and they wanted him alive. He kept waiting until he heard loud and hurried footsteps. "Identify!" he yelled out, and heard some skidding as the figures stopped quickly.
"Delta Team, identify!"
"Creature 88.
Are you all right, Shade? We lost contact shortly after you called for us to assault the building."
"Someone sent in a hit team."
"What?"
"Enemy commandos."
"There's no such thing."
"Then who the fuck did I fight? You can come in, but move slow, weapons down. I'm not in a particularly friendly mood right now." He waited until he saw a few Yervesh commandos glancing around the corner. They had masks closer to what he was wearing, which were obviously better than what the satyr had, but they had assault harnesses like him. If they were as good at stopping energy weapon fire like that satyr stuff had been, then clearly that wasn't the stuff they'd been giving him while he fought felons. Who the fuck could have better armor but worse helmets? It was all confusing and unclear. He lowered his magnum and stepped out from behind cover. "All right, you guys are clearly patrol. How bad was resistance?"
"It wasn't light, that was for sure. We thought we'd clear them out, but a few minutes ago there was a large rush of them coming from downstairs. They'd clearly abandoned more defensible positions in favor of trying to rush us, and we don't know why."
Vincent looked back at the shards of mask around the corner of his previous cover, and the 2 knives on the ground. That was the only evidence of the hit team commandos that had tried to give him a run for his money. If he only had energy weapons, they'd have killed him for sure. The Magnum wasn't something they'd plan on, it seemed, which meant they weren't connected to the dragon. "I have a pretty good idea why they wanted to get away from this level, but it's really not something you're going to want to hear. I need to get our superiors on the line, because suddenly it doesn't look like Patrol has the only commando force in the city anymore."